Public was invited to speak in front of a Maine-Canadian Legislative Advisory Commission on the impacts they're feeling from and seeing from federal tariffs. The commission consists of legislators as well as experts in the industry. They took in suggestions from the community on legislative changes that the state can do to help combat the impact of tariffs on Maine's economy. Those who spoke said that the state has seen a decrease of 18% in exports to Canada, with industries like logging hurting the most. Also adding that Maine and Canada have long been in a partnership for various industries, including trade and tourism, and the tariffs are negatively impacting that relationship. Some, however, recognize while there is change now, it doesn't mean the end of these partnerships.
The reality is that Canada isn't going anywhere, and although the relationship may look different in the future, short-term and long-term, there are still significant economic opportunities that we and others are pursuing. In April and again in December, delegations from Quebec came to Maine for business-to-business matchmaking programs, demonstrating a clear desire to not just maintain relations, but to expand them as well.
If we had more U.S. manufacturing and we got serious about U.S. manufacturing, I think there would be an equal and opposite reaction from the tariffs. But at this point in time, we don't have enough market share in the United States in order to offset the impact of the tariffs at this specific time.
Several pieces of legislation were brought up to help with the impacts that will be taken up in the spring. The commission will meet again in mid-January.